So welcome everyone to this ASCL seminar of 7 April 2022. We have a very special guest, Professor Moses Ochonu of Vanderbilt University, who will speak about, as you have seen on the website, Subaltern Metropolitan Adventure and Colonial Mediation in Nigeria. Professor Ochonu is Chair in History and Professor of African History at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, specializing in the modern history of Africa with a particular focus on the colonial and post-colonial periods. His main focus is on research focus on Nigeria. He has published 5 books, one of them edited. One of the books is Colonial Meltdown, Northern Nigeria in the Great Depression, Colonialism by Proxy. He edited African Entrepreneurship 4 years ago. And apart from his 5 books, he also wrote numerous book chapters and refereed papers, often with very original and insightful contributions to the study of African issues. One recent paper of note is the one of 2021 on slavery, theology, and anti-blackness in the Arab world, published in Research Africa Reviews, Volume 5. The subject of today's seminar is derived from Professor Ochonu's 5th book, Emirs in London, Subaltern Travel and Nigeria's Modernity, published this year by Indiana University Press. I admit I haven't read it yet. It just came out, but it seems to be extremely interesting and promising. The book analyzes the travel narratives of northern Nigerian Muslim aristocrats who traveled to Britain in colonial and early colonial, post-colonial times, exploring the travelers' own textual, visual, and material portrayals of their experiences and adventures in the colonial metropole. Of course, highly fascinating. These notables traveled to Britain between 1920 and 1960 for their touristic exploits and returned with stories and goods, writing Hausa and English language travelogues, giving lectures and so forth on their experiences. So Professor Ochonu's paper presentation will interpret this traveling, writing, and speaking endeavors as a form of colonial mediation. So he applies a kind of reversal of perspective. How did African elites from colonized areas who traveled to European countries for sightseeing, etc., portray these metropolitan cultures and peoples of the colonizer countries in their writings to African audiences? Of course, highly fascinating and original in terms of its subject matter. I also draw your attention in the framework of this seminar to a web dossier which our library has produced on African author travel writing. You can find it on the website related to the seminar. So Professor Ochonu, if you don't mind, I suggest you speak for about 45-50 minutes. Then we go to the question and answer session immediately afterwards. I will follow the questions also, the questions raised in the chats, and we can decide on what questions are most interesting to answer, and we'll see. Finally, of course, I would have liked the audience for live drinks afterwards at the ASC, as was customary in the not too recent past. But alas, in these seminars in post-COVID-19 times, we had to cancel that. Anyway, I look forward to a very interesting seminar. Professor Ochonu, may I invite you to take the floor?
Thank you, Professor Abink, and thank you, Professor Young Lennon, and all the crew at Leiden. I've never been there, and I hope to visit sometime soon. But there's a lot of amazing stuff going on there with regards to research on Africa. So it's a particular pleasure of mine to, be part of this, to present to this seminar. Let me try and see, let me share my screen. Sometimes it's tricky, but I hope that this is not a problem. There you go. Okay. Okay, let's see. Is that good?
Fine, yeah. One thing to the audience, please mute yourself when you listen to the presentation and only open it when you have a question or a remark to make later. Thanks.
All right, so getting into the talk, I mean, it's interesting because as Professor Abink said, the book from which this talk is drawn was released officially 3 days ago. So this is brand new stuff, and I'm eagerly but also nervously and anxiously waiting for the kinds of engagements that the book and this project will generate. So I'm previewing that engagement with this seminar. So I look forward to the Q&A. Subaltern, Metropolitan Adventure and Colonial Mediation in Nigeria is the title of the talk. As I said, it's drawn from this book that was just released by Indiana University Press, Emirs in London, Subaltern Travel and Nigeria's Modernity, officially published or released just 3 days ago. So shameful plug, if you don't have a copy yet, you can order one. That's I'm trying to do the capitalist thing by promoting my own publication. So this is the area that I will be covering in my presentation, Northern Nigeria, colonial Northern Nigeria. The upper part of this map in Nigeria represents the area from which this group of aristocratic travelers originated from. The project itself is informed by the convergence of two phenomena. The first one is the growth of Romanized mass literacy. Along with that was the growth also of vernacular, especially Hausa language publishing. There was this publishing infrastructure that evolved to cater to the reading palette, to the reading tastes, to the hunger for the written word, as mass literacy, Romanized mass literacy, grew in Northern Nigeria. And this vernacular publishing sphere produced newspapers, fiction, and travel memoirs. Of particular relevance to my work, the travel memoirs that came out of this vernacular publishing infrastructure. Along with this publishing infrastructure was also, of course, the growth of a public sphere, not necessarily in the Habermasian iteration or framing of it, but nonetheless, a discernible public sphere that promoted debate in the Hausa language, that promoted intellectual discourses and exchanges. As part of this public sphere, a big part of this public sphere was, the rise of Hausa adventure literature. This is a particularly important development, the growth of Hausa adventure literature, because this adventure literature, the devices used in writing this literature, the literary techniques deployed, the linguistic tools, all of these things came to be important for aristocrats who were returning from the United Kingdom, who were returning from Britain, to write their stories, because basically they were writing about their adventures in Britain. And so mapping their narratives onto this pre-existing vernacular Hausa adventure literary scene was quite important for them, because it simply meant that they were writing their narratives into a pre-existing vernacular literary and intellectual space. And therefore their narratives were more relatable because people in this region were already used to this genre of Hausa adventure literature. And we can talk about that later in the Q&A. The second phenomenon that informs this project, of course, is the production of these post-travel narratives by Roman literate Northern Nigerians, mainly aristocrats. Certain key events that are important for this project to keep in mind: the establishment of the Literature Bureau by the colonial authorities in Northern Nigeria in 1933. Many of the literatures, many of the pamphlets, many of the adventure works, fictional adventure works, or even non-fictional adventure works, the newspaper, they were published through this bureau, this literary bureau. I'm not going to bore you with the nuances. This bureau changed names several times in the course of the colonial experience, and later became, I think, a Geskia Corporation. But that's just minutiae that I don't want to bore you with. But another development that is of critical importance to this story is the establishment of the Geskia Tafi Kwabo newspaper. Truth is worth more than a penny. It's the literal translation of the name of the newspaper. It was established in 1939. Of course, the British colonial administration had other ideas for establishing this newspaper. The main idea, the main reason being that they wanted to counter German propaganda. They wanted to, as World War II was beginning, they wanted to use it to mobilize the Hausa-speaking population of Nigeria to support the war effort, but also to counter German propaganda. So but this newspaper, this vernacular newspaper, became a space and became a platform of much intellectual exchanges among the Roman literate population of northern Nigeria, school teachers, aristocrats, people who had the ability to read and write, people who could read, or people who could write. You could say that this was an incestuous intellectual community. They were writing for one another and they were reading one another's work. And all of this was happening on the pages of the Gaskiya Tafi Kobo. Most importantly, the narratives that I look at in this project, in these travel narratives, most of them were published in this newspaper, in this Hausa newspaper in Gaskiya. Some of these narratives, these travel narratives, metropolitan travel narratives, were published in form of memoirs. And notable examples of these memoirs are Abubakar Imam's Tafiya Mabu in Ilimi, Travel is the Gateway to Knowledge, 1945. Muhammadu Ndayako's Tafiya Etunupe Ingila, which is Etunupe's Journey to England, 1955. And there are several others as well that were published as actual memoirs. The newspaper travel narratives, many of them were serialized. Many of them were very lengthy. Some of them will be serialized and published over the course of several weeks, by the way. Right? A few just quick notes about the trips. The first one that I look at occurred in 1921. Muhammadu Dikko, the Emir of Katsina, made a trip to the United Kingdom, to Britain. By the way, he paired this visit with the pilgrimage to Mecca. So this was, this was a trip that he undertook, but also he combined it with the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. That's quite significant because he's not the only one who did that. That was not the only time either that he combined the trip to England with the trip with the pilgrimage to Mecca. The last trip that I look at in this project is the trip undertaken by the Sardauna Ahmadu Bello, the Premier of Northern Nigeria, in 1961. So I look in this project at individual trips undertaken by individual aristocrats and emirs. But I also look at what later came to be known as the annual group tour of Britain, which began in 1944. The Colonial Office organized these trips for groups of aristocrats, but also for groups of civil servants and clerks working in the Northern Nigerian colonial bureaucracies. And later on, these trips came to include the wives of these aristocrats. A few of their wives were included. And then much later on in the 50s, exclusive trips were organized also for women, just the women's tours. Typically, a group would have about 20 or 22 members. And they would typically stay in Britain for 6 to 8 weeks. What did they do in Britain? They would tour British governmental institutions. They would typically tour farms, mechanized farms, factories. They would tour the homes of British aristocrats. Sometimes they would get special invitations to go to these homes. They would tour these homes of regular people in the countryside. They were hosted at sports events. They were shown films, most of them propaganda, colonial films. They were hosted to tea receptions by mayors of towns and counties in the British countryside. And most notable of all, many of them were hosted at Buckingham Palace by the king. It was the king. The period that I'm looking at, it was the king. It wasn't the queen, so it was always the king. But they were hosted at these events. Their visit to Britain also involved talks and lectures The lectures and talks will be delivered to the visitors on topics as varied as British culture, the British people. These are just titles of certain lectures that the visitors and the tourists were given. British government, British agriculture, and so on and so forth. This lecture component was introduced in 1947. In certain rare cases, emirs, some highly regarded emirs would request a special itinerary, would request to be invited specially on their own to Britain. And in these particular cases, the itinerary would be customized to their taste. They would actually be able to dictate the terms of the visit, what they wanted to do in Britain, what they wanted to see, who they wanted to visit, and so on and so forth. They basically would be allowed, within certain colonial constraints, to design their own itinerary. I have a few examples of these types of private tours. And in some of these cases, the emirs would be wealthy enough to pay for these metropolitan adventures and indulgences. Certain notable details: the wives of aristocratic native authority officials were selected for the tour for the first time, as I alluded to, in 1955. Prior to that, some women accompanied their husbands to on these trips. Who visited Britain the most? That record and that distinction belongs to Muhammadu Dikko, the Emir of Katsina, who visited 5 times in 1921, 1924, 1933, 37, and 39. 2 emirs, Muhammadu Chugadu Ibrahim, who visited Britain in 1934, and Muhammadu Dikko, 1921, combined their visit to Britain with the performance of the Hajj in the Hejaz. When these emirs and aristocrats would return, they would deliver lectures on their adventures, on their activities in Britain, in both Hausa and English. Some of them delivered their lectures exclusively in Hausa because obviously they didn't know English. But several of them actually gave multilingual lectures. There's one that comes to my mind, that actually did a tour of Zaria town, and went around giving these lectures. But they would also publish these narratives in Gaskia Tafikobo, in this newspaper. And in the few cases that I talked about earlier, in memoirs, in published memoirs. Metropolitan travel narratives had resonances because, you know, the storytelling style drew from pre-existing Hausa vernacular literary techniques. So that's one of the points that I make continuously in this book. And in the Hausa adventure literature that I mentioned earlier, proved very critical in popularizing these metropolitan travel narratives, because the techniques of similitude, of metaphors, the idioms that the narrators and the travelers are invoking they mirror those of Hausa adventure literature and the techniques used in Hausa adventure literature. I'm going to elaborate upon that shortly. The metropole was a place of unusual social and recreational freedoms for these aristocrats. And I won't go into too much details about this unless someone asks about this in the Q&A, because I don't want to get in trouble. But this visit to the metropole was a place for these emirs to be free of the strictures and the restrictions and the restrictive protocols of emirate court life. In the metropole, they could indulge their social proclivities and adventurous spirits in ways that the tradition, the Islamic and the traditional rites of the court of the palace, the emir's palace, would not have allowed them to do In this way, I think the metropole, in a way, in some way, in a counterintuitive way, was a space where these colonized subalterns, these colonized aristocrats, actually felt at home. And many of them did express that. So that is one thing to keep in mind, because our traditional approach to the colonial encounter has always characterized and framed it in very adversarial terms. Why would subaltern colonized people find the metropole, the center of their oppression, the place where the oppressive colonial policies emanated from? Why would they find such a place? Why would they so feel at home that they find it to be a place of rest, a place of pleasure, and a place to relax? So maybe we can return to this theme later on. But the metropole did free them from the rituals and obligations and strictures of aristocratic life in the emirate in northern Nigeria. In planning these trips, in planning the itinerary for these trips, the aristocrats were not just docile recipients of British official or bureaucratic deliberations. They weren't just passive participants in the process. Many of them were able to make demands that the trip planners, the colonial planners of these trips respected, right? I don't want to see this, they would say sometimes. I do want to see this. This is what I would really, really love to see. I know that you want me to go see this farm over there or this factory over there, but this is actually what I would like to go. I would like to go visit with Frederick Lugard in the village of Abinga, outside of London. This is really what I would love to do on this day. Could you cancel this activity on the itinerary and replace it with this activity so that I'll go and visit my friend who was a former colonial officer in my emirate? He's now retired. He lives in this city. I would like to go visit him. Could you make room for me to visit this shop or that shop? Could you make room in this itinerary for me to go see an airport and to see planes taking off and landing? Some of them would demand certain, I want to go see the House of Parliament, the British Parliament. I would like to actually see the Parliament in session. So they were able to make these types of demands in the process of building the itinerary. They asserted their preferences, and they resisted some of the scripted touristic paths, right? Even during the trips themselves, the emirs and the aristocrats were always asserting their preferences. They would sometimes refuse to go on certain tours. They would sometimes refuse to go on some of these routinized scripted tours. Instead, they would say, look, today I just want to stay in my hotel room and just order things from Harrods and just order some items that I've always wanted to buy from Harrods or Goldsmiths, some of these high-end luxury stores. That's all I wanted to do today. I know you want me to go and see the British naval dock, right? And to go and see how ships are built and how certain weapons are produced. You want to awe and shock me, but I'm not interested in that today. Can I just have my time and talk to and see my friends, my British friends, and do some shopping while relaxing in my hotel room today? So they resisted some of the scripted touristic paths. And I think in this way, they were able to reverse some of and to complicate some of the efforts of the British Metropolitan authorities to perform what I call imperial hospitality for them. The whole point of their British host was to shock and awe them, but also to impress them, to show them the razzmatazz of the empire, the razzmatazz, the might of the empire, to impress them that, look, you belong and you are partners in an imperial system that is great, and we're going to show you how great the empire is. The technologies of the empire, the modernity of this empire is without rival, and we're just going to choreograph this modernity for you while you are here for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But the emirs, in many cases, complicated this story because they forced the colonial trip planners and the minders to respect their preferences and predilections. The aristocrats predictably, maybe not so predictably, did a lot of shopping, a lot of shopping. That was probably their favorite thing to do in Britain, just buying up luxury, high-end goods, including cars, jewelries, expensive robes, and what have you. That was just, they bought gifts, souvenirs, perfumes, fragrances, all kinds of things. That's their favorite thing to do. And they had money to do this shopping. One example that I like to give is Muhammad Dikko on his 1933 visit to Britain. He had his pocket money, his shopping money was £33,000, which in 1933, you know, when I started doing this research, one of the things that I did was there's a website that allows you to put in a figure, an amount of money in British pounds or in dollars, and you put the year, and then it translates it to the equivalent in today's money. And that amount, I think that at the time that I looked it up, it amounted to about £400,000 in today's equivalent. That's a lot of money to go shopping with for just a couple of weeks. They bought a lot of textiles. They bought some of these aristocrats. They bought royal stools for their palaces, for their court. They bought luxury cars. They bought prams. But in buying these items, they were not just passive, unquestioning consumers of these imperial commodities, these metropolitan commodities. In many cases, they remade these imperial goods. They repurposed them for their own ends. This is Dikko. This is Muhammad Dikko and his Morris car. You can see it in the background that he purchased on one of these trips. The aristocrats, the emirs in particular, were guests of the king. So several of them were invited to the palace. Muhammad Dikko probably was invited more times than any other emirs. I believe he was invited to the palace 3 times. He met with the king 3 times, I believe. He was knighted on 2 of those occasions. He was given a medal in the palace. And several of the emirs received honors from the king as well during these visits. One of the things to note about these visits, these tours of Britain was that wherever the emirs went, wherever the aristocrats went, they were subjected to what colonial documents describe as mobbing or press mobbing. They were followed around by pressmen, sort of like the paparazzi before the actual paparazzis that we know today. They were followed everywhere. But this was serious because they were exoticized. The reason why people follow them around, the reason why the press followed them around, and sometimes made life uncomfortable for them in public, made them miserable, really. Sometimes the press literally took over their path, and the police had to be called in to clear a pathway for them. The reason why was because they were exoticized, because they wore their robe, their traditional robes. And so in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, London and other cities in Britain, on Liverpool and other cities, these were, they were seen as very exotic. They were seen in this very, as foreign, exotic. They were even orientalized in many ways because sometimes they would ask them, are you from India? What part of India are you from? What part of, they were mistaken for all kinds of things. So they were mobbed wherever they went. They were seen as human curios and a spectacle. And so on some occasions, they had to actually call off certain visits to certain places. On one occasion in Liverpool, there was window shopping. They were window shopping for, the emirs were window shopping for jewelry and other items. When the press attention became too much, they had to call off the shopping trip because it was just too much. The crowd had gathered, people were shouting questions at them, they were shouting comments. The press were pushing microphones onto their mouths and asking them all kinds of questions. And some of those questions were quite racist and, condescending, by the way. So it was quite an embarrassing spectacle. There was a lot of overt racism as well. In 1924, the Emir of Katsina, Muhammad Dikko, was invited to the Empire exhibition, and the exhibition had what they call a West African village, which essentially had some Hausa people on display, purportedly in their traditional Hausa village setting. They had them for several weeks. They would have them cooking and doing household chores, and British people, for the entertainment of British spectators. And the Emir of Katsina was invited into that space. And it was a very awkward exhibition because there were groups of Africans who were protesting the racism of this exhibition. African students and some Caribbean students joined them as well at the same time. I don't know if Muhammad Diko actually witnessed some of this, or even had a consciousness about this racist spectacle, because he was ferried around in chauffeur-driven cars in this quasi-official, quasi-diplomatic circuit. So he probably didn't see this demonstration, these street demonstrations against the racism, but the racism was there. Another incident that illustrated this racism was I believe in 1938 or 39, 34, right, 1934, when a group of emirs visited. They spent some time in Liverpool. And it turned out that they were put in a very dingy, very unsanitary hotel on the outskirts of the city. And they had to complain because these were aristocrats. They were used to living in very comfortable quarters and in very comfortable homes. And the hotel was just so dirty. They didn't have running water. They didn't have hot water. It was just beneath their standards. And so they complained. And in complaining, they were given the runaround. It was embarrassing because the real reason why they had been put up in that hotel when there were much better hotels was that no other hotel except this one would accept them as guests. No other hotel, because they were Black, because of their race. And this was something that colonial authorities reluctantly and embarrassingly had to admit. And you see it in the colonial correspondence, but it was quite embarrassing. What are the arguments? What are my arguments in this project, my overarching arguments? I look at this Metropolitan travels and the texts that came out of them, these travel narratives, as forms of colonial translation. I see these aristocrats as translating metropolitan ideas, metropolitan goods, metropolitan modernity into vernacularized forms and frames. How do I say that? When they would narrate the metropole, what they saw in the metropole, what they did, who they talked to, what they bought, and so on and so forth, what they ate, they would always make reference to vernacular items or vernacular equivalents, what they saw as the vernacular Hausa, Northern Nigerian equivalent. So the House of Parliament, right? When they would talk about the parliament, they would talk about it in terms of, imagine a mosque, right? With a liman, with an imam, a prayer caller, right? Right? And with the congregants seated, that's how they would describe the British Parliament. And but they would say, well, the only difference is that in this particular case, the liman is not the only one speaking. He speaks, but the other members are given opportunities to also speak. Okay? They would describe the airplane taking off and landing as the eagle, or some other birds that people are familiar with in Northern Nigeria. They would describe the underground, the London Underground. They would describe it in terms of, in order to make it relatable to their audience, their Hausa-speaking audience in Nigeria, they would say, well, imagine a rodent digging on the ground and traveling on the ground in its burrow, and then coming out from the other end, And, of course, Hausa-speaking people would be familiar with this because there's this tradition of hunting for rodents, farauta. And they always, I'm from a part of Nigeria where we are so big on the hunting this type of rodents. So, these rodents, they would burrow into the ground, but there will also be an escape hole. So the London underground coming out, going on the ground, but also coming out at some other ends and going on the surface and alternating between the two. That's how they would describe it. So they were translating this into vernacular frames and into vernacular idioms that their audience could relate to. The Subaltern traveler was a colonial explorer. That's my claim, that's my argument that I'm making. He basically reversed the traditional European colonial gaze, colonial ethnographic and traveler gaze. He was writing back to empire. He was exploring the world of the white man in the same way that the white explorers, the British explorers, were exploring Africa in the 19th century, in the 18th century, and so on and so forth. If you look at the term in their narratives in many ways actually mirrored the narratives of European colonial explorers and travelers within Africa in terms of the techniques and the narrative techniques, the explanatory models, the self-referential mode of narration. In other words, using yourself as a frame of reference for narrating the other, for narrating the society that you're narrating, something that colonial European explorers did quite often. The emirs also did the same thing. They would always use their society and themselves and their own experiences as frames of references for narrating the metropole. The other argument that I make is that curiosities of empire, which drove exploration on both sides, were not exclusive to Europeans. Europeans wanted to know about African societies. And so they traveled, Mungo Park, David Livingstone, all of these characters that we know, they traveled to the societies of Africans to learn about the flora, the fauna, the cultures, the peoples. But this curiosity that drove them is not exclusive to them. I argue that this curiosity can also be found among the subalterns, among African colonized peoples. As much as the Europeans wanted to know about Nigerians and these aristocrats wanted also to know about the world of the white man. They wanted to know the white man and what drove him, what made him tick by traveling to his habitat, as it were, right, which is the metropole. So knowing the metropole was critical, was important for an African, for a Nigerian, for a colonized person, because it gave you resources with which you can navigate colonialism. It gave you resources to help you avoid the worst of colonialism, but also to benefit, gave you resources to put you in the good graces of the white man, to ingratiate yourself with the white man, because you knew the metropole, you knew his society, his natal society, his behavioral patterns. It gave you an insight, a special insight. So it helped you to navigate colonialism and to gain the benefits of colonialism while avoiding its worst aspects. Another argument that I make is that minutiae was important, details. If you claim these emirs, if you read their narratives are full of atomistic details. They will go into details about mundane activities and mundane phenomena and goods, metropolitan phenomena. They will describe in great detail how metropolitan cows were bred. They will talk about the quarry. I mean, this, to a modern reading audience, it's almost nonsensical. You see, like, why are they going into this much detail? Who wants to read this stuff? This is boring. But I argue that details mattered because if you claim, as these emirs and aristocrats did, if you put yourself on a pedestal and you claim that you are an authority on the metropole, you are an authority on the ways of the white man, then you have to prove it. One way to prove it is through detailed narrative. So detail in this context was not mundane, it was not just minutiae, it was critical to, I argue it was critical to this travel narrative, to this genre. It was critical to proving the authority, the metropolitan authority of these emirs. To authenticate, it was critical to authenticating their claim that they knew the metropole so well and that they could communicate with their audience, with their subjects about the ways of the white man from an authoritative perspective. The emirs, I would also argue that these trips promoted a strange affect, a strange logic of affect and connection and kinship between the aristocrats of Northern Nigeria and their counterparts in Britain. And this was done through the game of fives, polo. When they would visit Britain, they would play the game of polo. They would participate in other equestrian sports. They engaged in aristocratic pastimes. They went to races. They went to dog races, horse racing. They went to all of these events with their British aristocratic friends and partners. And this created transracial aristocratic kinship amongst them. I argue also that these emirs and aristocrats were not just collaborators, they were not imperial loyalists, they were not enamored or just simply, unquestioningly adulatory of British imperial institution or the royal family or the British king. They were also critics of colonial modernity. They used these narratives to critique certain aspects, many aspects of British life, many aspects of metropolitan life, many aspects of British society that they didn't find palatable, they didn't find quite endearing. Okay, so I'm positing this project to critique this literature of imperial loyalism that tends to look at many African aristocrats as people who were loyal, people who were endeared to, people who had this affinity for or affection for the empire or imperial institutions. I think that's a simplistic narrative, and I'm trying to complicate it. The emirs and aristocrats appropriated, repurposed, and remade colonial goods. They demonstrated alternative ways of being modern. They showed that you could be a Muslim, but also you could be modern by embarking on these trips, by buying these goods, bringing them back home, by participating in this commodity culture, by saying adulatory things about Britain, but also by critiquing it, by engaging in this nuance, this complicated enterprise, and this relationship with the metropole. They showed that they could embrace modernity or British modernity, but also by being Muslim. And they modeled it to their subjects. They showed regular Muslims that, look, you know, this is how to navigate the imperial system and imperial culture without running afoul of Islamic injunctions and prohibitions. You can do it. If we can go to the metropole and spend 6 weeks there, we didn't fall into any of the forbidden things, and we come back and we bring the goods, we bring cars, we bring weapons, guns for hunting, we bring gramophones, we bring jewelry. You can participate in this modernity without letting it pollute your Islamic devotion. There were imperial brokers. I posit them as mediators. They had traveled to Britain, and the material culture that they brought back with them enabled them to translate imperial culture into Hausa sociolinguistic idioms. They vernacularized metropolitan material and commodity culture, and they produced texts that I think, you know, if you look at the text that they produced, I argue finally that these texts are just as important, right, as the texts produced by non-aristocratic African subalterns, okay? Because typically in colonial historiography, in African colonial historiography, we tend to assign and to ascribe more weight to the experiences, to the narratives of regular Africans, especially subaltern, non-aristocratic Africans. We think of their colonial experience or their experience of colonial oppression as being more authentic because they were not privileged. They didn't have the privileges. They were not partners in colonial administration. They didn't derive any benefit, we argue, from colonialism. So we tend to authenticate their experiences. We tend to privilege their experiences. But I'm arguing that we can learn a lot from the writings and the experiences of these aristocrats in the orbit of colonialism as well, in spite of their privilege, in spite of the fact that many of them were partners in the colonial enterprise. The metropolitan travel reinforced class differences. They brought goods that reinforced their aristocratic lineage and pedigrees, that essentially sharpened the class divide in the society, that said, look, I'm going to make myself even more special. I'm going to buy these cars, these luxury cars, right? I'm buying these luxury cars, I'm buying these exotic items from Britain. And so in that way, it definitely put them, it made them even more aristocratic than they already were. And this is why NEPU, certain NEPU actors, NEPU was a leftist-leaning mass organization or political party. Certain members of this political party criticized the emirs. They criticized them for going on these trips and indulging in these aristocratic adventures when there were so many poor people in northern Nigeria. Some of these monies could have been better used to cater to their needs, to take care of their poor subjects. Why are you spending all this money in the white man's society? Why not keep this money here and spend it on your people? The Talakawas, the masses, they could use this money. So these trips generated or intensified class tensions within society. Not only that, certain clerics, notably Sheikh Abubakar Gumi, criticized these emirs and aristocrats for desecrating Islam, for desecrating their religion. Because whenever some of these emirs would go to Britain, they would receive these awards from the king, right? They would receive these medals. And these medals, he argued, had Christian or neo-Christian origins, right? They were named after the order of St. Michael, St. this or St. that. They had this explicit or implicit neo-Christian connotations. And the question that he would always ask is, will the King of England, could you ever get the King of England to come to Northern Nigeria, to come to your domain and accept an award named after one of the prophets of Islam, or named after Usman Dan Fodio? And that was a rhetorical question that he posed to the emirs in criticizing their metropolitan adventures. Let me show you some of the nuggets from these scripts as I try to round up now. Let me show you just some nuggets, some excerpts, right? The metropole, they would always say in this narrative, they would always complain about the architecture of the metropole, that it was bland, that it was unvarying, that if you've seen one British house, you've seen all the others, that they all look the same. They always said that. And they always talked about, at the same time, they always talked about London as a city. They always called it the city of cities. Like this excerpt that I have here, Dunia and Abrunel London. Essentially, the world begins and ends in London. They always had this highfalutin, exaggerated, this hyperbolic way of representing London. But at the same time, that was always tempered by this complaint that the architecture of London was just too bland and too uniform. It just had this characteristic that was just too boring. And they always talked about life in the metropole also being too regimented, too fast-paced for their liking. No one had time to relax, they would always say. White people didn't relax, they didn't enjoy life, they didn't spend time with their family, they were always working. Everybody was always going somewhere. People were too much in a hurry, too serious. And this is what Dicko says. In Katsina, we laugh. The English have too much to think about. Your amazing inventions have lengthened your powers, but shortened your chances of happiness. This is what he tells a newspaper in an interview during his trip to London in 1933. They complained also about River Thames. They took them to see River Thames to impress them. And they said, well, this river is insignificant compared to the Niger River in our country. You see an incipient critique of British military-industrial complex in their narrative. They're always talking about, why are you preparing for war? Why are you always taking us to see your weapons, to see your warships? When everywhere you say you are for peace, you say you want to promote peace, but you're always preparing for war. You're always building up your armament. You're always taking us to see your factories where you make your machine guns. And why are you spending so much money? Preparing for war and building up your military-industrial complex. Of course, they didn't speak in these terms because, this is a more recent framing or conceptualization of their critique. But I would argue that theirs was an incipient early critique of what we now call the military-industrial complex, especially in the British imperial framework. And so now I'm just going to show you a couple of photos and then I'll close. This is Dicko and his entourage at London's Hyde Park in 1933. This is Dicko and his grandsons at London's Hyde Park in 1933 as well. This is Dicko and his son and successor Usman Nagogo and his grandchildren at North Weald Airfield in the UK in 1933. This is during a visit to the Palmer's biscuit factory in Reading in 1933 as well. And this is Dicko sitting on the chair of the Lord Mayor of London, 1921, flanked by his two sons and his brother and another official, and of course the mayor himself. This is the Sultan, the emirs of Kano and the emirs of Gwandu, 3 emirs visiting in 1934. And they were visiting a Royal Airways plane, admiring the plane and being given some talk on it. And this is Frederick Lugard in the middle with the three emirs, the Sultan, the emirs of Kano, and the emirs of Gwandu at the London Zoological Garden in 1934. The British press covered the visit extensively, and this is a clipping from one of those coverages. You can see it says the Emir of Kano's visit. I think this was in the London Illustrated News. This was published in the London Illustrated News. This is the Emir of Katsina again, and his entourage admiring a traffic light in London in 1933. And this is Dikko's picture shows Dikko's wives being shown around London separately by the wife of one of the colonial officials who volunteered to be a tour guide for Dikko and his entourage. So his wife becomes a tour guide for Dikko's wife. And this is them. Dikko's sons and grandsons visited the BBC. And this is them in the studio trying on some of the equipment in the studio. This is a picture of Dikko's grandsons at the London Zoo, playing with a penguin. This is Dikko and his entourage observing a bear at the London Zoo. This is Dikko and his entourage at the Northwood Airstrip. This is also from a Metropolitan newspaper. You can see the coverage right here at the bottom. The headline is Nigerian potentate and his retinue in London. This is another press clipping from the coverage of the visit. More coverage of the visit. And this particular picture was taken at an elementary school. Dikko's grandsons were playing with a tadpole in a jar. They had a tadpole in a jar and they were playing with it. And this was given to them at the school. You know, they were having fun with other kids in the school. This is Usman Nagogo playing polo at the Ketlington Polo Club outside of Oxford in 1939 when he visited. As I said, whenever they would visit several of these aristocrats, especially the Dikko clan, because they were into polo, they were polo players, they would always make it a point to go to one of the polo fields in England to play. This is Nagogo at the Ketlington Club again. And this is a commemorative tray. After they returned from the trip in 1933, Dikko and the colonial authorities in Nigeria commissioned this tray to be made to commemorate his visit to Britain. And this tray depicts he and his sons and some British officials on horseback in a polo field. And this is the Katsina Emirate Palace facade, the front facade. When he returned from Britain in 1933, Dikko ordered the front facade of his palace to be torn down and to be rebuilt in the model of Buckingham Palace. He wanted to reproduce the front facade of Buckingham Palace. He wanted to make his palace, the front facade, to look more like Buckingham Palace. This is as close as they came to doing that. And this is the old palace facade that was torn down to make room for this, the new one. And I close by showing this photo because the most popular item, I talked earlier about how shopping was their favorite thing to do in Britain. Well, one of the most popular items that the emirs and aristocrats bought was the perambulators. Many of them bought this. And so it took me a while to figure out why they did and what they did with it in Nigeria. But I got many stories when I was interviewing people in different parts of northern Nigeria. I got several conflicting stories, and I had to walk through these stories to try to figure out why these perambulators were so popular with them and why they bought so many of them. So maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A. But thank you for listening.